Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in existentialism in the novel by Reine entitled She Died, Then Showed Me. We're going to take a look at a very, very powerful chapter 13, and let's go to block 1 and get started. Okay, block 1. From anticipation to contemplation. Anticipating her future story. Peyton goes for an early ride across the range to the top of the mesa to what she labels as the fortune of serenity. So evidently the ranch does still hold a very special kind of wealth. She dismounts and snaps a few photos for possible future paintings of her story. You see what's going on here? She's anticipating her story. She is the eschatological person. She is writing her own last start. And now we get a picture of her anticipating the future, going out of the self in charity. Father Gabriel calls with a request for help. The grandmother is going to the hospital, and the two grandsons need a place to stay. Peyton and Laylee both agree to offer this charity. And Peyton even intends to spoil them just a little bit. But now she anticipates her future in note 1. Now she goes out of herself in charity in note 2. So let's take a look at 1:3. Returning to the self in contemplation. Adler arrives and Peyton rushes to meet him at the front door, but he actually goes to the back entrance instead. He does give Peyton a gift of an arrangement of yellow tulips and a fresh trout for grilling at a future date. And Peyton considers them a gift of gentleness. But look where they go. They both retreat to the terrace for conversation and contemplation. So it's going to be a contemplative encounter, which makes sense. We had anticipation of the photos on the top of the mesa, anticipating her future story. Then she goes out of herself in charity, and now we find her on the terrace in return moment of internalization, of contemplation. So that's the perfect picture of a dialectic in block 1. Perfect dialectic in block 1. In herself, in anticipation, going out of herself in charity, returning to herself in contemplation. Let's move on to block 2 and take a look at Peyton shares her story with a powerful trust. Okay, block 2. Dialogue about passion. Peyton shows Adler her father's broken mechanical clock, and Adler agrees to take it and see to its repair. Next, Peyton takes Adler to the home gallery upstairs to show him the copies of her mother's work. Peyton says her own paintings are of a different kind than her mother's, but I love what Adler says. He confesses to seeing passion in the work of her mother. He says, I see passion in her work. Now we come to a key moment in the gallery. Self-portrait, but is it self-story? Adler examines the portrait of Peyton, but he says it also could be a self-portrait of Harlow because Harlow and Peyton look very much alike. Adler says he sees loneliness and roaming in the eyes. Now, does that loneliness and roaming apply to Harlow, or does that loneliness and roaming apply to the previous old self of Peyton? The reader is left to work that out for themselves, and that's fine. But here's the key painting, the portrait of Peyton's parents. It's a painting of Sorensen sitting at his desk in the intellectual light, while Harlow is reclining on a sofa in the shadows, but with her eyes open. She's not sleeping, but she is in the background. She's in the shadows. Peyton admits that she feels the painting shows how her parents' lives were flawed. Good point, because aren't we all flawed and in need of help? That's everyone. That's every man, that's every woman. We are not perfect human beings. We are flawed, and we all need help, and we all need help in addressing and building and reframing our own existential last start. So we're all flawed. We're all in need of help. Then Adler and Peyton return to the terrace. They return to that, which is good because they're returning from the gallery for further contemplation. And I love the way that the chapter closes out. It closes out with the need on the last start for Peyton to be vulnerable, to be real, and to be anchored. It's essential that she be vulnerable, real, and anchored. Take the risk of being vulnerable, being real, and maintaining being anchored. Let's look at block 3. Adler and Peyton gather at the terrace. Again, for reflection, Adler confesses that Peyton differs from what he expected. And he compliments her. He says, you know what? You make yourself vulnerable and you are real. He doesn't see any artificiality in Peyton. Huge compliment. He also sees her as grounded. And then he adds, but unlike your father. I didn't perceive your father as grounded, but he does see Peyton as a grounded individual. Truth in relationship, Adler confesses possessing a genuine infatuation for Peyton, and he does kiss her. Peyton confesses that Adler is one who gravitates to original nature. She sees him as a genuine, as one who gravitates to original nature. She sees him as grounded and genuine. They both agree later that they had talked about what was important on the terrace. I think that's very good. They agreed that what they had talked about on the terrace was important for both of their lives. Let's go to 3:3. Okay. So what are the conclusions that we apply to this eschatological last start of Peyton for chapter 13? Number 1, we are all flawed. We are all in need of help. Help sometimes comes in unexpected ways, but only if we remain taking the risk of becoming vulnerable and real, but at the same time anchored to originality and truth, while keeping our language focused on that which matters, on that which is important. And then we allow ourselves a time of Sabbath rest. They kind of close out in a time of rest, and that's important, because that time of rest is a time where you process all of your internalizations. We need that Sabbath rest. We'll use the theological term here. We all need Sabbath rest. It's a time of sorting through that which you have internalized. We all need it. Everybody needs it. Peyton needs it. So it's very important that's part of this chapter. To do a quick recap here, I think that the most important thing to remember here is that block 1, chapter 13, begins with very powerful dialectics. You've got Peyton in herself in anticipation of her future story. Then you got Peyton going out of herself in an act of charity toward others. And then you got Peyton returning to herself in contemplation on the terrace. Remember the symbolism of the terrace, it's the symbol of contemplation. This chapter begins with pure dialectics. Anticipation, going out of the self, and charity, and return to the self in contemplation. Now, block 2 is a little bit of a task for the reader, because in block 2, note 2, the portrait of Peyton is debated. Adler says, well, this could be a Peyton of Harlow, or it could be a Peyton of you, a painting of you, Peyton, because you and your mother look alike. There's just differences in hair color. But that comment that he sees loneliness and roaming, is that the old self of Peyton? I tend to say yes, but it could apply to Harlow as well, because Harlow was flawed. Peyton's old self was flawed. So it could apply to either. Now, in block 2, though, the key point is the portrait of the parents. You've got that radical conclusion that we are all flawed, we are all in need of help from that spirit which is greater than ourselves. We all need help from that divine spirit which is greater than ourselves. Sorensen needed help. That's why he felt drawn to the mission church. Harlow needed help. She was flawed. She felt drawn to the mission church. Peyton is flawed and in need of help. She felt drawn to the mission church. And so, where do they go? Where does the flawed character go? Among the poor. Not to the rich Catholic diocese. Those in need are drawn to the mission church. They're drawn to the poor. Beautiful imagery. I love what Reine did here. They're drawn to the poor. That's where real enlightenment and hope will come. And then we have to admit that in block 3, the conclusion, 3:3 to the chapter. We are all flawed and in need of help. Help sometimes does come in very unexpected ways, but we must take the risk of becoming vulnerable and real, but at the same time anchored to originality, always anchored to the truth, always anchored to the way, the truth, and the life. And we keep our language focused on that which matters. And then there has to be a time of Sabbath rest. There has to be a time to reach kind of a restful introspection, to process everything that's been internalized, to process the dialectic of anticipation, and then charity, and then contemplation. The key to this chapter was block 1. It really was. If you want a framework for chapter 13, it is block 1. It's a triad. Anticipation in the self, going out of the self in charity, returning to the self in contemplation. That is the structure of chapter 13. Put a big, huge circle around block 1. I know it's the beginning of the chapter, but it's the key to the chapter, because it's the key to writing the last start. It's the key to Peyton's eschatological life. Anticipation, which is what? Hope. We have a hope for a better self. We have a hope for a new self. We have a hope to write our own eschatological last start. But it only comes if we're willing to go out of ourselves in charity, in love toward the other. And then we can return from that charity to contemplation, introspection, and the processing of what we learned in the act of charity, in the movement and the reaching out in charity, in loving one another. So the structure is given to us in block 1. Then we get to that key second moment. Your second moment is always your key moment, but it's block 2, note 3. It's the portrait of the parents. Because we've learned earlier that Peyton is declared to be like her father in the intellectual light, but also like her mother, retreated in the shadows, but with eyes open. She does have that artistic temperament to some degree, but she is also intellectual like her father in some degree, but she's more than an extension of her parents. She must write her own story. She must write her own authentic, existential, last start, eschatological story. There is so much here to be excited about, and I think Reine did a fantastic job in chapter 13. It's very, very powerful. But again, the structure to the chapter is block 1. Anticipation and hope in herself, going out of herself in charity and loving one another, then returning to the self in contemplation and internalization. Very, very powerful. That wraps up chapter 13. We'll pick up chapter 14 next time, 153 to 167 next time. Chapter 14 next time, and that wraps up a very powerful chapter 13.